has at the IEA. Digital markets and digital trade have emerged as a key priority for the British government. The last few weeks have seen some important developments. The Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport published proposals that it says will reshape our approach to regulation of data protection and seize opportunities with our newfound regulatory freedom outside of the EU. They say this will drive growth and innovation and competition across the country. It's seeking agile and adaptable data protection laws that enhance the UK's global reputation as a hub for responsible data-driven business that respects high standards of data protection. Sounds great. The incoming Secretary of State for International Trade made her first speech in her new role at a technology conference and used the opportunity to unveil a 5-point plan to bring down digital trade barriers and help British businesses export their world-leading services. So that's the political framing, but what's behind these headlines? And what's actually in the detail of these plans and proposals? Well, I have two experts with me today to discuss this. Ted Claypoole is the head of IP Transactions and FinTech at leading international law firm Womble Bond Dickinson. Based in the United States, his practice spans all sectors of the information economy, and as well as a practitioner, he's also the author of books on privacy and data security. And Camilla Veale is head of regulation at Coadec, the Coalition for a Digital Economy, the UK's voice of digital startups and growing companies. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Thanks. Delighted to be here.
So, Camilla, I'll come to you first. Can you give us a flavour of the kind of changes to our data protection regime that DCMS has in mind in its current consultation? What exactly is the kind of thing that's in these proposals?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, with this consultation, I think the government's really pushing for data to be the sort of central Brexit dividend. And so just some of the reforms they've suggested are, for example, providing greater legal clarity on what constitutes scientific research and extending the legitimate interests lists for data processing. Sounds really dry and bleak, but for AI startups, for example, that we work with, this is quite critical in terms of like accessing data sets that they can use, as well as lots of other tech startups. Other things that the government's proposing is allowing personal data processing when studying bias in AI systems. So that's GDPR is a sort of very technically neutral regime, but this is going to sort of start building on the AI tech strategy. They're also looking at increasing smart data sharing, so looking to build on the sort of innovation that open banking unlocked, as well as just general reforms to the structure of the ICO, including encouraging more open dialogue with business, and of course, most controversially, some reforms to GDPR.
And Ted, you published quite a punchy article about what you think, about why you think the EU will take quite a dim view of this and of any reforms really that the UK tries to make. Can you explain why you think that the European Commission will take this view, and also why it matters if they don't think that our data protection laws are adequate?
Absolutely. No, it's interesting, and I think some of the problem comes from Brexit itself, right? Because even pre-Brexit, the UK tended to be on the more business-oriented side of still making sure it was protecting privacy, but also caring about being balanced about it. Whereas a number of the EU states didn't seem to care about that balance so much. Here in the US, one of the big examples of that was the Schrems II decision, which left a lot of room for interpretation. It threw out the privacy shield, but there were other ways to send information back and forth between the US and the EU. The UK, being part of the EU at that point, from a regulatory standpoint, essentially said, don't worry about this, we've got it. There are ways that you can be careful and responsible and still share. Whereas, for example, some of the German states said, nope, everything has to be housed here in the EU. You can't send anything to the US anymore. We're taking an absolutist position. The French were somewhere in between, and the Spanish, as usual, we're just making money off the whole thing. Kind of a speed trap of privacy, as it were. But so the UK has always been a little more on the business-oriented side of this when it comes to interpreting. Not, I believe, when it comes to protecting its own people, which the UK does an excellent job of. So that said, the EU looking at this when the UK broke off, the EU looking at privacy issues, first of all, looks at it suspiciously because the EU is breaking away. And as I've always said, the minute you tell somebody, I don't want to live with you anymore after 40 years, there are going to be emotions beyond that are probably not logical. And I get a sense that that's some of what's happening here. But also some of what's happening here is they understand that the UK has had these tendencies to be on the more business-oriented side before. Now, why does this matter? Because the EU has, and the UK will soon have, what's called adequacy decisions, which are the ways of dealing with countries that they feel either do or do not respect the privacy of the data that comes into that country from their place. So, that didn't used to be an issue for the EU and the UK because they were one. Now that they're separate, there's a separate adequacy decision made about the UK. And unlike other adequacy decisions that the EU has made with Canada, with Israel, with some of the little island groups, for example, that they actually put the UK on probation when they gave the adequacy decision and said, unlike some of the others, this only lasts for X amount of time, and we're going to be watching you carefully in that time. And so what that means is if the UK loses its EU adequacy decision, then it makes it harder for data to go back and forth, and businesses will have a more difficult time.
So, I mean, for me, I guess, regular viewers or readers of the things that I publish would probably know that I am pretty critical, actually, of the GDPR regime and the whole approach, really, what's become a very prescriptive approach, and the way that's been implemented by the Information Commissioner's Office in this country. I wonder, Camilla, first of all, do you think the proposals, and do the members, the dynamic startups and technology businesses that you interact with, do they think that these proposals go far enough? Do you think perhaps the UK should have done a full ab initio review of, is this way of regulating, defining personal data the right way to go? Should we be considering something much more revolutionary? And I guess part of that, following on from what Ted just described about the European Commission perhaps withdrawing adequacy from the UK, which will place barriers in the way of data transfers between the EU and the UK. Do you think perhaps that might be worth it? And actually, if we can make sufficiently helpful changes that will remove bureaucracy and free up innovators and service providers to really do more with data in this country, might that be a price worth paying for, might losing adequacy be a price worth paying for making those reforms? What's the feeling amongst your members?
So I don't think you're going to like my answer, because the answer at the moment is we're still consulting. The consultation was only just recently published, so we're still talking to startups about what they think. What I can say so far about GDPR reform and adequacy is startups they tend not to be always major lovers of GDPR. It costs them a lot to implement, and it has given them problems. And also they're very annoyed if they've put a lot of effort into implementing GDPR and then other businesses just ignore it and the ICO doesn't come down on them. So there are lots of problems with GDPR. They're not exactly happy. But adequacy with the EU is a critical issue for startups because we have a very small digital market, and most startups, if they're going to succeed, they need to scale, they need to grow, and for many, many startups, that means going into the EU and going into their digital market. So I think I would say that startups are cautiously interested in what the government has to propose, but for them, for most of them, adequacy is the thing that they absolutely need to maintain. But, you know, I may be able to come back in 2 months and give a whole different answer, but at the moment we're still consulting.
Ted, what do you think about that? You know, how much do you think from the US side would you expect your clients to be willing to accept a tougher regulatory regime in the US in return for getting that prized adequacy decision from the European Commission?
I don't think they care that much, frankly. You know, and I'm talking primarily even about the clients that are responsible and want to protect data the way that they understand that their customers want it protected and that regulators want it protected. I think the problem and the difference here is that a lot of the EU regulators look at this as a zero-sum game, right? In other words, if you provide a better regime to small business, then somehow you have to hurt consumer privacy by doing so. And I think that's just wrong. That's just flat wrong. One of the things there are two things that the recent guidance coming out of the UK has noted that I think are very important for small business. One is more consistency, and two is a easier way to interpret some of the ambiguities.
Yep, definitely.
And that's ultimately you know, an easy thing to do that doesn't change the protection for people, but makes it easier to manage. I mean, I can tell you, my father used to say he didn't care how much taxes he was charged as long as it was consistent year after year, so he could plan for it. And I know that other businesses, he said that as a small businessman, and other businesses have that too. I mean, they want to follow the law, but it's not entirely clear. The GDPR is so massive and so complex and touches so many different things. And even then, the previous law that it modified already had a lot of complexities built up into it that the GDPR didn't really affect. And so if what the UK is saying is we're going to come in and make it easier to understand, easier to cooperate with this, easier to know that you're doing the right thing and not causing a problem accidentally or in some way that you don't, you know, you're not trying to cause an issue with, you know, that you will somehow get a regulatory slap because of that. I'm all for that. And I think all my clients are too. So I think one of the problems here is that false dichotomy of you can't help business do this better without hurting consumer privacy. I think you can, and I think the UK regulators understand that, and they're starting to look at that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, in fact, I published a paper last year calling for certain reforms to the way our regulator, the Information Commissioner, and the Information Commissioner's Office handle certain things, because it seems to me that because the GDPR and other associated privacy and data protection regulations are so complex and wide-ranging, and in fact, some specialist privacy lawyers think it's actually not possible to comply with all of it. That actually does put a lot of discretion and power in the hands of the regulator as to whom they choose to enforce against. And because the fines are so enormous, can run to tens of millions of pounds, and have indeed, such fines have been levied, I wanted to see a lot more accountability and scrutiny of the actions of the regulator, and I'm happy to see there are some proposals in there that are being consulted on about making some changes on the regulator, though I'm not sure they quite go far enough for my liking. But anyway, moving on to digital trade more widely, I mentioned earlier that our new Secretary of State for International Trade, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, gave her opening speech focused on digital trade and tackling the barriers to digital trade. Of course, data protection requirements are a very important part of that, but there are also lots more things like intellectual property laws and other discriminatory requirements where you have to disclose technology in order to trade in a country or localize your data in local data centers, all of these kinds of quite pernicious requirements that lots of countries use. And typically, of course, in international trade, they make out that these are necessary things for protecting their citizens, whereas oftentimes it really is just protectionism. Camilla, what did you make?
Further than that.
Ted, I'll come to you first then.
Yeah, well, just quickly, many of the countries you're talking about are folks like Russia and China that are doing this to control their own people. And so, yes, there are also, it's been interesting that countries like Germany are talking and France are talking very firmly about data localization. But the truth is most of who does this at the moment are regimes that are trying desperately to keep a control over their people and limit their freedoms.
Right, and arguably, we might come on to this in a moment, the UK is slightly going down that road ourselves. But Camilla, what did you think of Anne-Marie Trevelyan's speech? Do you think DIT's identified the right kinds of issues? And what do you think is the likelihood of breaking down those barriers? I guess in particular, considering those aspects that Ted's just outlined, where there's quite a lot of geopolitics involved here.
Well, the short answer is yes. We thought it was a fantastic speech, and DIT for a very long time has been very well regarded in the tech ecosystem space. They're seen as very proactive and supportive, and so long may that continue. I think when it comes to what I think the outcomes are, the devil is always in the detail, and certainly the sorts of things we will be looking for when we come to look at what DIT does is, as you mentioned, pushing back on sort of data localization and restrictive data flows. Anything that touches on that, we will be very worried about. And of course, as you also mentioned, pushing back on forced data transfer of intellectual property, including source codes, encryptions, algorithms, anything like that, we'll be very worried about. But we think a major outcome that we hope will come is expansion of regulatory bridges. So there's been a lot of innovation done for fintech startups with expanding how regulators talk to each other and ensuring that startups can bring their products to new markets quickly and cope well with new compliance requirements. So anything we can do with that in terms of emerging technologies would be fantastic. And then more minor things which will unlock a lot more trade, we think, things like ensuring digitally interoperable digital identities, for example, would be looking out for. So yeah, those are the main things I think that we will be looking at what DIT does when it comes to new trade deals.
Ted, how does this look from the US perspective? Will the UK find support on this? Obviously, the UK has had our voice in international trade agreement settings sort of subsumed within the EU's trade policy for, decades. And so I suppose this aspect is seen as being a key offensive concern that the UK can perhaps push for more liberalisation independently of the EU than perhaps we could while we were a member. Do you think the US sees the UK now as an ally in these sort of discussions? Or actually, might the USTR, the United States Trade Representative, and your trade negotiators be thinking of raising some of their own issues with some of the UK's domestic policies? I'm thinking in particular about things like our online safety bill, which is this forthcoming legislation that is actually, as far as I can tell, seeking to regulate the entire internet to control what people can say to each other. Or maybe they will think our data protection reforms don't go far enough and that they still amount to forced localization measures in some ways. What do you think?
in general, the U.S. in particular is supporting the EU, especially in business-oriented and counter or cross-border cooperation as far as regulation. But you're absolutely right that something like digital identities could go a long way if they were recognized, even across the Anglophone world, of finding a way to support a digital identity that could be separated from people so that their privacy wasn't put at risk, and yet people can do business and conduct their own personal affairs online in a safe way with the digital identity. That would be something that certainly the US would support. But you're right, any place where it looks like anyone, the UK or anyone else, is trying to put limits on speech in general, in particular, isn't always an issue for the US, is that's one of the very few areas outside of the privacy space that the US has a underlying difference in the way that we're set up than the UK, and that is what kind of speech is allowed, particularly when it comes to defamation issues and how those are litigated and how those are discussed and regulated online. And so that will be probably an issue for the US, but otherwise, I think there are a lot of folks in the US that believe that they should have better and more consistent national protection of digital privacy. I still don't see that happening anytime soon. It's not a priority in Washington. 35, 40 bills come up every year. None of them make it out of committee. That's gone on for the last 15 or 20 years. But you're going to continue to see states with more omnibus privacy legislation. Two of them, Colorado and Virginia, passed them this year. California actually stepped up its privacy requirements, and that's going to drive what the US can do. And it's going to drive how comfortable it is US businesses are in being able to meet the obligations that the UK is putting into place.
So, Camilla, I mentioned briefly the online safety bill. I know that's something that your members and you have expressed some concerns about. We also have something, we haven't even mentioned so far, the digital markets unit being set up within our Competition and Markets Authority that, again, essentially wants to regulate the activities of digital platforms in a very prescriptive way, judging by the proposals that have been put forward for its new powers. Do you think that there's a tension here between the government's desire to really empower our digital sector and encourage innovation, and it has this digital strategy, all of which sounds great, but at the same time, as they are trying to perhaps reduce some of the bureaucracy attached to data protection and free up businesses to innovate more, they are also, with the other hand, adding more and more prescriptive regulation that's going to have the opposite effect. Do you think that there's some perhaps inconsistency there, and how are we going to navigate through this this tension?
Well, obviously by talking to the IEA and supporting the IEA. Yeah, I think there is a little bit of tension. I think that often that stems from regulation that is quite badly drafted. So I think that a lot of regulation, like the online safety bill, is quite clearly targeted at big tech giants, and yet it's going to pull in so many other smaller tech companies and companies that can't cope so easily with regulation, or just really the problem being unclear regulation. Regulation that needs fleets of lawyers that can sort of sift through it and work out what the hell you do. And I think so that's partly one of the tensions. And I think the other tension is we need more people in government who understand how the tech ecosystem works and how tech companies work as well. And I think we could improve that tension by having those two things happen.
Ted, you have quite a lot of similar concerns happening as well over in the US. There's a constant sort of political drive to break up big tech or do something about their perceived dominant position, both from the right and the left. The left think that big business is too dominant. The right thinks that Facebook and Google are biased in a certain political direction and are censoring them. So where do you foresee any regulatory steps in that direction coming to fruition in the United States?
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting because really the last 18 to 24 months have seen that movement in the US. Europe has been active in fining under antitrust and privacy and other rules, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, others, for several years now. However, the momentum has really turned on big tech in the US in the past 24 months or so. And on top of that, you take a look at who President Biden has put in key positions in his administration. First of all, the assignment of Lina Khan, Professor Khan, to be the head of the Federal Trade Commission. She is best known as someone who has creative ideas about how to break up Facebook and Amazon. And so they're so upset about it that within weeks of her being confirmed, at least Amazon, and I think a couple of others, have specifically asked for her to recuse herself from any issues concerning them because they think that she is biased. And I think they have an argument, although I don't ever appreciate those arguments because it goes back into what you were saying to a certain extent about why the right is upset with them, which is they don't like a referee, right? They want to be able to commit their fouls without a referee blowing the whistle and throwing up the yellow card. And so for the right wing, the referees have been Facebook and others who've said you just can't say this kind of stuff online, and so they don't like to hear that. But another person who was added, and now I'm blanking on the guy's name, but is the man in charge of pursuing antitrust within the Justice Department. And once again, someone who has a excellent reputation over the years of having ideas about how you go after big tech. And why is that important? Having creative or interesting ideas, because the markets that have been created around the big tech companies are unlike markets that we have seen before. And so you have to place that regulation in an intellectual context that makes sense. And one of the reasons that in the US, the big tech companies have been able to get so big for so long is people couldn't really figure out what box to put them in to say, is this more like what Standard Oil was doing when it made railroad deals that it was the only one that could ship oil across Pennsylvania, or is this more like what another company was doing in the 1920s that we held was an antitrust issue, or is it something completely different? So the Biden administration bringing these people in who have an intellectual heft and an intellectual basis, who have thought through these kind of issues, makes it much more likely that that regulation is going to occur.
Yeah, well, and there's the same sort of debates as you say happening in the EU and in the UK as well. My fear is, of course, that we're going to end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater here and actually losing the dynamism and all those qualities of the big tech companies that have really transformed so much of how we live our lives. Go ahead, Ted.
No, I agree with you on that. But one of the things that I like about, for example, Lina Khan's thoughts on this are simply look at the behavior, don't look at the results. If you're being a jerk and that jerkiness is against the law and problematic, then that's something we'll look at, rather than simply saying, well, we've looked at the numbers and these people are too big, or we've looked at the numbers and we can't do anything because in part of this, in part of the way we're looking at this, consumers are actually benefiting, for example, from the fact that Amazon is providing books at a lower price for a while to drive all its competitors out of business, and then raises the price again when they're the monopolist. Right.
Well, I think we're going to have to get you back in for a debate on the antitrust aspects another time, because I mean, I completely agree. Of course, consumer welfare has got to be the end goal and the lodestar of any competition regime, for sure. And I do think that sometimes gets lost in regulators and politicians just being very suspicious of bigness per se. But as I say, we'll have to come back to that one another time. I'm going to close by asking you both for, I guess, a note of optimism. Do you have a prediction for a positive reform that you can see coming in the digital trade space, whether that's in the UK or Ted, go ahead and give us an example from the US. Camilla, what do you think? Is there something positive we can look forward to coming out of this?
I mean, what a question to end on. It's a fantastic question. I haven't prepared for it. I mean, I really am very, very hopeful for what we can do with smart data and the innovation that we can unlock with that. So data portability more generally, and as I said, expanding regulatory bridges, which I aware, again, sounds very dry. My entire job, in fact, sounds dry. But that's what I'm going to go for.
Ted, do you have an optimistic prediction?
I do. I think over the next 5 years, we're going to see interesting thoughts into artificial intelligence and into how we reduce bias in AI without having a deep, intrusive regulatory scheme. Because I'm hearing some excellent suggestions and ideas, both in the US and the UK in this space. It will be an important space over the next several years for small business in particular. And I think that regulators are likely to begin looking in the right direction on this.
Well, let's hope so, because that really could be, well, both of those could be really transformational developments if we can make the most of them. But that's all we have time for today. This has been a really fascinating discussion. So thank you very much both for joining me. And it would be great to come back to these points as the themes develop. I'd also like to thank our listeners and viewers for joining us. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. We're producing a wide range of original content every month on the IEA, so if you like what you've heard and seen, please subscribe to the IEA YouTube channel. You can support the IEA's digital output on Patreon, where we have set up a membership platform that allows our followers to donate solely towards our digital work. As an online patron, you will have access to exclusive IEA content and perks, priority access to our content, and much more. If you would like to directly help the IEA continue to produce stimulating educational content, go over to patreon.com/IEA London. Thanks again, and goodbye for now.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.